So we could probably continue on with healthcare all today and all tomorrow and still not have solved the problem. But I think it's time to move on to budget reform. Budget reform moved up my list of important topics after the political brinkmanship we saw at the end of July and early August, with our politicians arguing over whether to or how to raise the debt ceiling. We're very fortunate to have Shauna Rose of the Wagner School of Public Service, New York University, to present her thoughts on budget reform.
Great. I want to start by thanking John and George and the Baker Institute and the sponsors for inviting me to speak here today. So there's no question that the federal deficit and debt are on an unsustainable trajectory today. Debt held by the public nearly tripled to 62% of GDP over the past decade, and current projections have it rising to 82% in another decade. And of course, the deficit is hovering around 10%. We had the debt ceiling debacle this summer and the first downgrade of U.S. Treasuries in history. So the question is clearly not whether something needs to be done, but rather what needs to be done. How do I advance the slides here? Oh, there we go. As is often the case when the federal government is trying to figure out what to do, they are increasingly looking to the states as laboratories of democracy, as the states and many municipalities have experimented with a variety of rules, including balanced budget rules, similar to the balanced budget amendment that is currently under discussion in Congress, debt limitations, which are more stringent than what we see at the federal level with the debt ceiling, tax and expenditure limits. We're not explicitly talking about that at the federal level right now, but if you look at some of the proposals for balanced budget amendments and so forth, they have effectively tax limits and supermajority rules for raising revenues. And of course, the line item veto never seems to go away, thanks to Senator McCain, and so I'll speak about that as well. Unfortunately, I'm going to continue on the theme from the first panel, which is a pretty gloomy theme. I'm not going to have a whole lot of good news for us today. The bottom line of my talk is there's really no silver bullet. The states haven't figured it out. I know newsreel at 11. State financial conditions are not perfect either. But there are some, I think, very valuable lessons about if you are going to do something like a balanced budget amendment or the line item veto, how to go about designing it and what are some of the pitfalls that you might run into so that we can work around those and anticipate those. But the bottom line is these rules have been pretty much a mixed bag for the states. Just to sort of set the stage a little bit, I want to briefly compare the federal and state situations when it comes to deficits and debt. So this picture should look familiar to most people in this room. This is the federal picture. So we have the bottom line, the blue line is the deficit, as I said, currently hovering around 10%. Then we have debt held by the public, which is creeping up currently around 62%, but rising very rapidly. And then there's the gross federal debt, which is currently over 100%. How does that compare to what's been going on with state and local governments over the same time period, or roughly the same time period? We don't have data going back quite as far for states and localities. Well, just focusing on the states, we see quite a bit of variation, but the mean, if you focus for a moment just on the red line, that's the mean surplus or deficit, you'll see that it's actually a mean surplus of nearly 1% over the past roughly 50 years. And obviously there's quite a bit of variation. There's, I imagine the green state is some state with a lot of oil. It's probably Alaska or something like that. It could be. And contrary to public opinion, states do run deficits now and then. There's a misconception out there that because states have balanced budget rules, they don't run deficits. They do, and I'll come back and address that in a moment. Some of them do, I should say, not all. But you can see that on average, over the past 50 or so years, the states have a better track record than the federal government. The federal government almost always has a deficit. The states almost always have budget balance or a small surplus. When we turn to debt, it's a similar picture. Debt in the states over the past 50 years, mean debt has averaged about 6% of state GDP. Again, we have a considerably higher high and a much lower low, closer to zero, but on average the states have done pretty well. So these are the kinds of comparisons that sometimes lead people, whether it's federal policymakers or scholars, observers, to say, well, the states balance their budgets and they're in better shape, so maybe we should do what they do. So that's sort of the basis of my talk today. I want to start with the balanced budget amendment, partly because it's going on right now as we speak. This House Judiciary Committee is talking about this, holding hearings and so forth, and there's supposed to be a vote later this fall. So it's very timely, and it's one of the major proposals out there. And so just by way of background, I'm sure this isn't really news to anyone in the room, but this is not a new idea. The balanced budget amendment, not a new idea. It was first proposed by a representative in 1936, and there have been a number of votes on the balanced budget amendment in the House or the Senate, and it's passed in one or the other. The closest we came was in the mid-90s. The House passed it, and the Senate came within one vote of passing it. And of course, this is just the first hurdle. You need 2/3 in both houses or 2/3 of the states to even propose it. And then to ratify it, you need 3/4 of the states. We don't have 3/4 of the states. We have almost 2/3 of the states have petitioned for this since 1975. So 32 states. We need 34 states to get a constitutional convention on this. So keep falling short is the bottom line here. Meanwhile, in the absence of a balanced budget amendment, Congress has periodically experimented with various rules like Graham-Rudman-Hollings or the PAYGO rules with mixed results, right? And this could be, I could do a whole talk just on this. Maybe one of my discussants will say more about this. I'm not so much a federal person as a state and local person. But bottom line, mixed results. Graham-Rudman-Hollings deficit targets, those were pretty easy to get around with optimistic projections. And PAYGO worked somewhat better, but also was increasingly easy to get around with by taking advantage of the emergency spending loophole. And those two things are trends that you're going to see when I talk in a moment about how balanced budget rules work at the state level. We see those same types of gimmicks and manipulation and taking advantage of emergency waiver features. Okay, so that's the bottom line. That's the background. What's going on right now? Currently, the House and Senate are looking at proposals that have some or all of the following features. President has to submit a balanced budget. Outlays must not exceed receipts. Outlays must not exceed 18% of GDP. So this is sort of like an expenditure limit, which a lot of the states have. Supermajority requirement for raising revenues. Several states have rules like that, so I'm going to talk about those as well. And a supermajority requirement for raising the debt limit. And several states have those as well. So I'm going to talk about some similar provisions. There are different versions in the House and Senate right now, but some will allow some of these provisions to be waived in the event of war or by a supermajority vote. But in some cases, you can't waive all of the provisions, just certain ones. So what do we have at the state level? Well, nearly all states have ex ante or political rules. These are sometimes called prospective balanced budget rules, which like the balanced budget amendment proposal I just mentioned, require the executive to submit a balanced budget. Others have rules that require the legislature to pass a balanced budget and or the governor to sign a balanced budget. Some have all three. So when we say all states have balanced budget rules, that's what we mean. But those rules, it turns out, as I'll show you in one slide, really don't have much effect at all. Those aren't what people like me who study these kinds of rules don't really worry about those at all too much because they don't have much effect. What we're more interested in is about half the states have stricter no carryover rules which prohibit the government from carrying a deficit into the next fiscal year. So these have more teeth. And depending on, who you ask, these are enforced by the courts, or they're really in practice enforced more by credit rating agencies, because the states are very afraid to get on the wrong side of the credit rating agencies. And so they, when it gets to be the end of the year, they balance their budget, or else they are going to face higher borrowing costs. Typically, these rules apply to the operating budget, and in practice that means the general fund only. And so anything like the capital projects funds, or other funds that aren't part of the general fund don't apply. And so this might be anywhere from 50 to 70% of your budget that you have to balance, not the whole budget. Some of these rules are constitutional and others are statutory. So what does the empirical evidence say? As I mentioned on the previous slide, the political rules, the ones like governor has to pass a balanced budget, or propose a balanced budget to the legislature, they don't have much effect. And the reason is that they permit unexpected deficits, which means you can get around them by forecast manipulation and accounting gimmicks. Right? Anything that happens after you enact the budget is fair game, in other words. And so that's how a state can both have a balanced budget rule and also run a deficit, is because the deficit is unexpected. And in some cases it might truly be unexpected, and in others it might be engineered. Evidence on the effectiveness of constitutional versus statutory rules is mixed. Early studies showed that it mattered, that constitutional balanced budget requirements had more teeth. More recent studies, some of which are done by my co-author on this paper, Dan Smith, who's also at NYU with me, suggest that this distinction doesn't matter. So there's some debate in the literature there, but it's interesting. It's interesting from the standpoint of federal reform. Do we need a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution, or should we go the legislative approach with another more beefed up PAYGO type rule? Additional evidence on the strict rules. So these are the no carryover rules. There's a huge literature on these, and by and large, people find, they are associated with smaller deficits. There's a ton of studies. I don't expect you to be able to read all this fine print down here, but I'm happy to share my slides if anyone wants them. These are all my citations. More rapid adjustment to fiscal shocks, better credit ratings, reduced capacity for political manipulation. So in other words, lowering taxes right before an election in order to win the election, but that causes you to run a deficit temporarily. That's harder to do. However, some downsides of these strict balanced budget rules in the states. And this first one is really important for the federal government. Reduce capacity for countercyclical policy. That's a huge problem for a state or local government. That is an enormous problem for the federal government. If you just try to imagine what the past 3 years would have looked like without automatic stabilizers and the stimulus, that's what we're talking about. So that's a big one. I'll come back to that in the conclusions as well. Finally, lower pension fund levels. So states that are struggling to balance their budgets, a lot of times what they do is underfund their pension systems in order to do that. And so just sort of it's just one sort of measure of, this is coming at a cost. There are trade-offs here. There are tough choices that you have to make, and when you're forced to balance the budget, sometimes things don't get paid for. Okay, turning on to the second institution that I want to take a look at, debt limitations. So these can take many forms. By and large in the states, these are debt ceilings expressed either in dollar terms, so like if it's a municipal government, so many $1 million or $1 billion, or as a percent of the tax base. A lot of times these rules have provisions for exceeding the limit. For example, for certain types of capital projects or certain types of, say, home rule municipalities can do certain things that other types of municipalities can't. Second, we have voter referendum requirements, so either a majority or supermajority of voters have to sign off on the debt. And then finally, we have legislative supermajority requirements for debt. And this last one is the one that's most similar to what people are talking. Well, really, the first one, the debt ceiling, and the last one are what people are really talking about at the federal level. This is really important. These rules typically apply only to guaranteed GO debt, not revenue bonds and things like that. That's really important, as I'll explain in a moment. So what does the empirical literature say about the effectiveness of these debt limits? Most of the literature, especially the recent literature, says they have little to no effect. This is sort of surprising because we just saw strict balanced budget rules do have the desired effect. Why don't they have much of an effect. There's a huge literature on trying to figure out why this is. And people have put forward a lot of potential explanations that actually make a lot of intuitive sense. And so one possibility is debt limits reduce guaranteed debt but increase non-guaranteed debt. For example, because in my home state of New York, there's just suddenly a whole lot of authorities that are issuing bonds that are, we call it backdoor borrowing, where really the state is guaranteeing the debt through some backdoor channel, but not officially doing so. They get around it by setting up these authorities and commissions. So the problem is, again, as I said on the previous slide, what does the rule apply to? If it applied to all debt, then maybe it would work. The downside is then you wouldn't have much money to do capital investment projects. So again, there's this trade-off between making a rule strict enough so that it works, that it has the desired effect, but also realizing that it's going to come at a cost. The third type of rule that I want to talk about is tax and expenditure limits. These can take many forms. Typically, the most common type of tax and expenditure limit is an expenditure limit. It's a limit that links spending to something, whether it's state income, inflation, population, or some index of those variables. A little bit less common is revenue limits that work much the same way. Then there are a few things that most people lump in with tax and expenditure limits, but that are a little bit different. The first one is a restriction on appropriations that links it to 95 through 99% of the official revenue forecast, depending on the state. Right, so the idea there is just to create a little buffer. Requirements that voters approve, that doesn't make sense. Requirements that voters to approve tax increases, little typo there. Requirements that voters approve the tax increases, right? So in a lot of the referendum type states, we have these types of tax and expenditure limits. And then finally, legislative supermajority requirements for tax increases. This one's particularly interesting at the federal level because we're contemplating that currently as part of the balanced budget amendment debate. What does the literature say? Most of the literature finds tax and expenditure limits are not so effective. At the state level, I'm going to get to the municipal level in a second. At the state level, TELs don't seem to work very well. Why not? Again, there are very intuitive explanations for this non-finding. At the state level, you can just shift burdens to the lower government. So you can shift it down to municipalities, down to special purpose districts, and so forth. And if they have the responsibility for providing the service, they have to come up with the revenue, and you can get around it. Similarly, TELs typically apply only to certain types of revenues, namely tax revenues. And so you can get by relying more heavily on things like user charges and lotteries, or perhaps debt financing if your state doesn't already have a strict debt limitation. The one type of rule that does seem to work is the supermajority requirement for tax increases, and this one's a little bit mystifying why that one works and the other ones don't. But there's a couple of really good papers by Knight and Besley and Case on this, and I think they offer some plausible hypotheses which are escaping me at the moment, but perhaps someone will remember during the Q&A. However, municipal tax and expenditure limits do seem to be much more effective. And in particular, the numerical TELs, the ones linking spending or revenues to an index, a numerical index, seem to restrain taxes and spending. There are several studies that sort of drill down a little bit deeper and say, how are they doing that? How are they restraining spending? And what are the implications of restraining spending? And they find that part of the story, not surprisingly, since at the municipal level, public sector wages are the number one item on the budget, it's through wage and employment reduction of public sector employees. Similarly, teachers, a lot of public employees are teachers. You pay the teachers less, and then you get worse teachers. So some interesting sort of downsides of, yes, they work, but at what cost? Also, there's some evidence that tax and expenditure limits compromise the government's flexibility in responding to economic downturns. So this, again, hitting on the point that I hit on earlier, is this is a problem for a municipal government, but that government can be bailed out by its state and by the federal government. What happens if we do this kind of thing at the federal government? Who's going to bail us out? There will be no one left to bail us out. Finally, the line item veto. So the line item veto, as we all know, we did have one briefly in the mid-1990s. And it wasn't truly a line item veto because there were a lot of limits and exclusions on it. Basically, it was for new discretionary spending, new entitlements or enhancements to entitlements, and a very narrow definition of taxes. Nonetheless, despite these limitations, it was ruled unconstitutional in 1998. But that has not stopped its co-authors from trying repeatedly over the past 15 years to get it back. So Senators McCain and Carper have sprung into action with this whole debt super committee, arguing that the line item veto should really be on this agenda for reining in the nation's debt. They say it'll be a good budget scalpel for eliminating wasteful spending that's not in the best interest of our country. They've put together support from quite a few senators. Their proposal basically would focus on earmarks and other non-entitlement spending. So already you can tell that this is not going to have a huge effect because earmarks, as much as there's uproar over earmarks, we're talking about pretty small potatoes there. They're going to try to get around the constitutionality problem with this up or down vote on the president's proposed cuts. So we'll see if that flies. What do we know about the line item veto at the state level? Well, just first let me briefly explain what institutions exist at the state level. So all governors, strictly speaking, not so much, but in a manner of speaking, all governors have the authority to veto appropriations bills in their entirety. There are one or two exceptions, but by and large, that's true. This is often a blunt and useless instrument. A governor almost never wants to throw out the entire appropriations bill. So in 43 states, the governor has a line item veto, which means he can remove particular items within an appropriations bill. Then what started happening was in a lot of legislatures, they would add together a bunch of items, sort of creating mini bills within the bill because they didn't want the governor to delete one of those items. They'd put it in with a bunch of items that he did like. So that's where we got the item reduction veto, where governors can reduce the amounts of items within bills, within appropriations bills. What does the empirical evidence say? Negligible effect. Negligible effect on both the composition of spending and the level of spending. Why is this the case? There's a huge literature on this. A lot of people have done case studies where they looked at thousands of vetoes by particular governors, and they found that these guys were really using the veto mostly for political and policy goals. They were using it to strike language and things like that. They weren't so much using it to cut amounts as they were to cut language. Other studies have pointed out that the legislature is just going to respond strategically. If they know you're going to cut a bunch of stuff, they'll just add more stuff. Others have said, no, it's really about the size of the log roll, and typically you need a supermajority to overrule the governor's veto, and so they just have to put even more goodies in for that strategic purpose. So there's a bunch of different stories out there, but by and large it seems that the item veto and the item reduction veto don't have much effect. However, the item veto does seem to increase executives' budgetary influence. And if you read the current debate about the line item veto at the federal level, there's a lot of concern about this. Basically, we're not going to get anything in the way of deficit reduction here. All we're doing is shifting power from Congress to the presidency, and depending on your politics, that's a good or a bad thing. Okay, so just to conclude, I think probably that none of this will be too surprising, but these are sort of my big takeaways from my research and my colleagues' research on state and local rules. The first is that the devil is in the details. It really matters how you design these rules. So, for example, the strict balanced budget rules reduced deficits or associated with reduced deficits. Weaker ones, those ex-ante ones, the political ones, don't seem to have much effect. All right. Similarly, tax and expenditure limits that link spending to, the inflation rate and population, not so effective, but when you ask a supermajority of the legislature to sign off on any tax increase, that seems to work. Second, tying one's hands comes at a cost, right? So even if you design the rules correctly and they're strict enough to bind, then we're still faced with tough choices. That's our problems have not all been solved at this point, right? Then we have to make tough choices. Are we going to, at the state level, it's questions like, are we going to fund our pension plan? Are we going to cut Medicaid provider reimbursement rates? Are we going to cut, teachers? Things like that. At the federal level, it's a whole different set of tough choices that are going to have to be made related to entitlement programs, national defense, and so forth. Second, it really is going to reduce our flexibility to respond to recessions and wars and natural disasters. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the current balanced budget amendment proposals have these waivers in them for wars and things like that. The problem is we've seen from experience with Graham Redmond Hollings and the BEA that people will take advantage. Where there's a will, there's a way, is my last point. People will take advantage of that and in Congress and call things emergencies that aren't really emergencies. So there's this fine line between allowing for these waiver policies but not writing them in such a way that they're going to take advantage of it. That's my final point. I sort of beat myself to the punch. Where there's a will, there's a way. Rules are often easy to circumvent. And so really the bottom line here is what we need isn't rules so much as we need the political will to balance the budget. And that seems to be the key ingredient that's missing. We seem to have it briefly in the mid-1990s, but it was a lot easier to balance the budget in the mid-1990s than it is today. So I don't know how we get back to that place where people really, really wanted to balance the budget. I think that's the key, but I'm curious to hear what other people think. If maybe others are more hopeful about rules than I am. Thank you.
And so our first discussant will be Joe Barnes of the Baker Institute and Rice University.
Thank you. And I'll come in at less than 10 minutes. Let me begin by saying that I do not use PowerPoint. I can use PowerPoint. I choose not to do so. Let me say, first of all, that I was delighted to read the Rose Smith paper, and even more delighted to be able to comment on it. The authors note that it draws extensively on an earlier article by Dr. Rose called The Institutions and Fiscal Sustainability. I urge you to read the earlier paper in addition to the one that was submitted for this conference. The earlier one, I think, and you please correct me, Dr. Rose, spends a bit more time discussing the sort of theoretical background for why you would want these binding mechanisms. Many of them are essentially a sort of a principal agent question. Is a legislature a reliable agent for the voting public? So I do recommend that you read the earlier paper. The new one is however an authentically new paper that spends a great deal more time on possible federal efforts to constrain spending. The bottom line, as I take it from reading the paper and from listening to the presentation, is that there are no easy answers, though some variation of a rule or amendment constraining the ability of the federal government to carry over a deficit might be helpful. Just a few comments. I'll focus on what I consider to be some of the political elements involved with this, and then move on very, very briefly to discuss a matter that Dr. Rose herself mentioned, which is the whole question of a balanced budget amendment in the midst of a giant recession. Every day is fun nowadays, isn't it? Let me just mention that Dr. Rose in her paper mentioned that we live in a highly politicized environment. Well, I think that this is doubly true when it comes to discussion of a balanced budget amendment. At the federal level, a balanced budget amendment is by and large a Republican initiative. although it does have Democratic support, particularly among so-called blue dog congressmen. It's interesting to note the two high points in agitation for a balanced budget amendment. Once was in 94-95, when it passed the House and came close to passing in the Senate, and then this year, when a vote on it was included as part of the compromise to raise the debt ceiling. What do these two periods have in common? Well, not gross amount of debt and not the amount of deficit in the given year. What they have in common is a highly mobilized Republican congressional caucus. 94-95, of course, was the Congress that came in with the Contract for America. Today, the balanced budget amendment is finding its strongest supporters in the so-called Tea Party faction of the Republican Party. The other thing those two dates have in common is a Democrat in the White House. So let us not underestimate the huge political factors that are at play in this discussion. Now, furthermore, not only is the balanced budget amendment a key tenet of the Republican Party, it is an object of passion for the Tea Party movement. The Tea Party faction in the House of Representatives originally demanded passage of a balanced budget amendment to agree to a debt ceiling raise. That was that terrible week when House Speaker Boehner kept on going to the caucus and being told no, 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 no. Well, that was one of the demands they made. They finally relented. And the faction also upped the ante, so to speak, on a balanced budget amendment by including such things as an expenditure cap of 18%. I would say that a balanced budget amendment does not just exist in a political sense, does not exist in a vacuum, but is part of what could be called the constitutional project of the Tea Party movement, which includes other things, such as the abolition or repeal of the 16th Amendment. For some of them, it also includes repeal of the 17th Amendment, believe it or not, which demanded direct election of senators, and an expansive reading of the 10th Amendment to the Constitution that comes very close to nullification. Andrew Jackson would be turning in his grave were he alive today. But there are actually senior American members of the Republican Party talking about nullification. So having discussed the political ramifications, let me move briefly on to the whole question of what would this be like? What would it be like today had we had a constitutional amendment of either kind when the recession struck? Well, as far as I can tell, it would have required cuts in excess of $500 billion or tax increases of $500 billion every year of the recession. The CBO was predicting a fiscal year 2009 deficit of over 8% of GDP before Obama was inaugurated. In other words, had either of these proposals been in effect when the recession struck, the effect would have been catastrophic on the American and world economies. You don't have to be a Keynesian to believe that tax increases or budget cuts of $500 billion or more with 10% unemployment might not be a good idea. Now, it's theoretically possible, I think, to come up with a more complex balanced budget amendment that would allow provisions for running deficits during recessions. But I would have to say that it raises a host of incredibly complicated measurement and definitional issues, not least of which is how hard it is to determine GDP figures in a real-time basis. We could make decisions on cuts on the basis of very, very faulty GDP data, as we've discovered with the recent revisions. It would also, I believe, the more complicated it becomes, I think it also would increase the possibility of gaming, as you've mentioned, the system. I also suspect that if you get a complicated balanced budget amendment, I think it would also probably be a political non-starter, because I think the Tea Party faction would abandon it, because the Tea Party faction wants to cut government in a recession. let me just mention one last thing. As it is, the states have been, and localities have been a huge fiscal drag on the economy already. Now look, maybe don't all agree with Paul Krugman that we're talking about 50 little Hoovers, but there is no doubt that the states have contributed mightily to the slowdown in the economy. Now, maybe, and I'm just talking, I haven't done full research, but I'm saying at least in the vicinity of $500 billion worth of fiscal drag since the beginning of the recession, only part of which was offset by federal aid to the states, and perhaps 500,000 state employees fired, with perhaps another 100,000 to come before the end of the recession. So we have a real conundrum. Here we are talking about applying at the federal level a rule that at the state level is materially contributing to the lengthening of the current recession. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Our next discussant is Dr. Rudy Pinner from the Urban Institute.
Thank you, John. I agree with Joe that this is a very useful paper looking at the role of fiscal limits at the state and local level. There are a few strong tendencies that come out of the paper, although you can find contradictory evidence on almost every issue. I feel a lot of sympathy for people doing empirical work in this area. I think there's several major problems. The first resort of scoundrels when faced by a constitutional or legal restraint is to engage in budget gimmickry of one kind or another. Unfortunately, the gimmickry often shows up in the historical record, and you can't really differentiate it from real policy choices. Just to take a federal example, I would argue that the Republican Congress went on something of a spending binge after they were totally surprised by a budget surplus in 1998. However, they cheated outrageously. They moved some of the spending backward into previous fiscal year. They moved some of it forward into future fiscal years. And in the end, you can't see any bump at all. They smoothed it all out so successfully. But empirical researchers have no choice but to use the historical record, and it can be very badly distorted. The second, longer-run resort of the scoundrels is to move activity into off-budget independent agencies and other accounts. There's some discussion of this in the paper related to debt limits, but I would have liked to have seen much more, in particular and related to balanced budget constraints. There's over 35,000 independent agencies and other off-budget accounts at the state and local level. I've been told, I haven't verified it, that there are more than 600 off-budget accounts in the state of Illinois budgets. What this does is make budgets extremely difficult to understand, first of all. And I would like to know a lot more about the history of that movement and how it's related to constitutional or legal constraints. It's not even clear to me whether much of this empirical work just looks at the spending and receipts that's affected by these restraints and what looks at the total activity of state and local governments. And if you look at the total activity, there's a really important question as to whether you look at the activity as measured in the national income accounts, where the business activities of governments are netted out so that all you see is the net profit or loss of business-type enterprises, or whether you gross them up as they do in the census of government. You get very different pictures of state and local activity depending on what you do. And the last problem bedevils all empirical research. Which way does the causality run? Do more naturally conservative states tend to adopt the most conservative spending, tax, and deficit restrictions? Then would they have more conservative budgets even if those restrictions did not exist? And that's a difficult thing to sort out, although there have been some attempts to do so in the literature. My own intuitive view is that the credit rating agencies discipline state and local governments to a much greater extent than do these constitutional and legal constraints. In my home, the District of Columbia, we live and die by credit ratings. Too bad it didn't work for the federal government when S&P downgraded the debt after the debt limit fiasco. But I agree in the end with the authors when they say that this whole discussion may not be very relevant for the feds. We have this cap, cut, and balance movement that would amend the Constitution, as was described by Ms. Rose. But I don't think it really understands budget arithmetic. With health and Social Security programs constituting almost half of non-interest spending, with the spending growing so rapidly, as we've seen in numerous charts put up at this meeting already, with it particularly soaring because so many of these programs are for old people and the baby boomers are now retiring in greater and greater numbers, the notion of capping spending at 18% of the GDP seems to me to be totally unrealistic. It'd take profound reforms in Social Security and Medicare that'd make them shadows of their current self to achieve this goal, and they must be two of the most politically popular programs ever invented by government. And I'm afraid that if the cutters and cappers achieved their goals, not many of them would be reelected. I don't know of any carefully formulated budget plan that would balance the federal budget before the 2030s. House Republican budget wouldn't do it. The President's Fiscal Commission wouldn't do it. The Domenici-Rivlin Committee wouldn't do it. 4 packages that I was involved in when I co-chaired Committee for the National Academies of Science and Public Administration didn't achieve that. As the paper says, the best you can hope for is to stabilize the debt-GDP ratio. 60% is a very common goal. The President's plan would take us above 70% in the next 10 years. There are 2 basic reasons that we're not making progress towards stabilizing the debt. First, the public and more than a few legislators are not aware of the basic arithmetic underlying the spending side of the budget. There's a great reluctance to believe that those 2 wonderful programs, Social Security and Medicare, could lie at the root of the spending problem. And even if they knew, it's not clear that we'd make much progress. Both political parties have become more ideologically pure than they used to be, and there's considerable evidence that the population is also becoming more ideologically pure. In other words, there's a bimodal distribution across the ideological spectrum, and there are not enough people either in the center or at the 2 peaks to form a majority for significant action. So with most Democrats strongly against reforming Social Security and Medicare, and most Republicans strongly against raising taxes, there's nowhere we can go. And as a result of this, the budget process is totally broken. The problem isn't a lack of rules. We have an incredible number of rules governing the budget process. The problem is that the Congress doesn't follow the rules that they have. The Senate hasn't passed a budget even for 2 years now. The House didn't pass a budget the year before. In addition to that, they never do appropriations on time, so we waste an incredible amount of effort bargaining over continuing resolutions that have to be renewed every few weeks, in addition to the confusion that causes for the bureaucracy. You couldn't have a better symptom that the process is broken than the debt limit debate of July. The Budget Control Act that emerged from that debate totally bypasses the traditional budget process and bypasses the budget committees of the Congress. Indeed, neither the chairman of the Senate Budget Committee or the House Budget Committee are serving on that supercommittee. I find that astounding. Now, if the supercommittee fails to come up with a solution, we'll have a totally mindless sequester that at maximum will cut defense 10% starting in 2013 and the non-exempted domestic programs by 8.5%. But then that doesn't happen until after the next election, so they got plenty of time to suspend the sequester if they find it too painful. So it'd be nice if a few extra rules could fix all this up, but at this point I'm about as depressed as I can get. I don't see a complete resolution of our budget problems until we are faced with a sovereign debt crisis. You have more time for a trivial point? 30 seconds. Well, just wanted to point out how little relevance the notion of an item veto has for the federal budget. The basic problem is that your typical appropriation bill has very few line items. Money is allocated to things like the bridge to nowhere using reports on bills, not in the bills themselves. And those reports have no legal standing, so a president can't veto them. However, the executive branch ignores them at its peril, and so reports are folded to the letter. A most minor budget reform, it's somewhat related to the proposed constitutional amendment, but it would reform what is known as the rescission process. It now allows the president to define a line item according to his wishes and to suggest canceling the budget authority. So he can cancel it for the bridge to nowhere. But that cancellation doesn't go into effect unless it's approved by Congress, and if Congress ignores it, the rescission cannot go into effect. I think it'd be very useful to force the Congress to vote on it. If they voted against it, they'd be saying this program the president thinks is wasteful seems wonderful to us. And as Ms. Rose said, you can't guarantee that such a rule would actually cut spending. Such rules are vulnerable to log rolling, so a liberal president could say to a legislator, I won't suggest canceling your program if you vote for my program. So I'm for enhanced rescission, not so much because I think it would cut spending, though it might on balance. I'm mainly for it because I think, and there's a lot of differences on this, that it would enhance the power of the president in the budget process. He has little power now. He's the only elected person representing the whole nation. I think the president should play a more important role. But that might be because I was born in a country with a Westminster-style parliament. So thank you.
All right, so we have just a few minutes. We have about 10 minutes for questions. We'll take 5 minutes of questions and then give a few minutes for Dr. Rose to respond to the discussants. And I guess you can ask questions of any of the three, Dr. Rose, Dr. Penner, or Mr. Barnes. So, Alan?
Just a quick factual question. In the state restrictions and rules, are the state courts ever actually called upon to correct any violation of them? And if so, how do they go about doing that? I mean, do they order specific spending cuts? Do they order a sequestration? I mean, how does that work?
Yeah, I can't think of one off the top of my head. When it happened, maybe someone in this room can. It's very rare, is my understanding. And in practice, the way that things are enforced is through the credit rating agencies. But states with constitutional rules seem to act in ways that you wouldn't expect them to without those rules. So if you compare states with and without strict constitutional rules, they do respond to fiscal shocks, for example, by tightening things up really fast, which suggests that maybe the credit rating agencies are looking at them differently than if they didn't have that constitutional rule. I've seen that argument made in the literature. Hard to know for sure.
Long ago, I had a conference on this, and now Judge Ralph Winters asked the question.
Can you stand up and face? I can't hear you if you talk this way.
Who could sue and who would they sue? I think that's the basic question.
Yeah. Over here, and then Judy.
Has anybody considered the fact that our government accounting is screwed up? We didn't balance the budget in the Clinton administration because we treat as income all the cash collected. In other words, when we're borrowing money, we treat it as income. We take all the trust funds. President Bush, the first President Bush, vetoed a bill for unemployment insurance extension, saying it would unbalance the budget. Yet that money was paid to the federal government by employers. These were trust funds. All the Social Security money is trust funds. I'm a CPA. The federal government is the only tax entity, government entity in the country that I know of that doesn't keep its books according to governmental accounting rules.
Yeah.
And until we begin to recognize that, and recognize that capital expenditures are not part of current expenditures, we're not going to straighten this thing out. And we've got to quit treating the money coming in for Medicare and for Social Security and other trust funds as income. And when you do that, the budget deficit problem is worse than we think.
I agree. Although I would say that I don't think the states necessarily, or municipalities. I know Houston's budget rules are not up to par in terms of the way they account for their pension expenditures and pension liabilities. Judy?
Question for Professor Barnes.
Yep. Yeah.
You're going to have to respond. You indicated that the states have contributed greatly to the recession.
Yes.
And that they, want to cut public employees.
Yeah.
And yet, here every major corporation in America that is finding that they don't have enough sales demand or whatever is having to cut. In your own household, if your income isn't enough, you have to cut. So when does one have the ability, in your view, to cut public employees if you don't have income?
You don't do it when unemployment's 10%. Okay? Now, as to the argument, and we hear a lot, and by the way, we hear it, I regret to say, from President Obama as well. The United States is not like your family.
No.
We are simply not a family. Families don't trade with each other. There is no unemployment within a family. I believe that there is such a thing as a paradox of thrift. I think that in a recession, if everybody starts saving more, that means they're spending less, that means there's less income, and there's a spiral created. Okay? I will say this, there is no more pernicious a metaphor in American politics today than comparing the 300 million person American economy to a household. They have very, very little in common.
There's also no bigger mistake than applying cyclical strategies to structural deficit problems. I mean, her question was a very good question. When do we do it? Do we do it when we're Greece? Is that when we finally cut government employees? Do we do it when there's...
The most pernicious thing in American politics today is comparing the United States of America to Greece.
Well, we just had a discussant say we won't solve the problem until we have a sovereign debt crisis.
We can. And you know when we can cut the budget? You know when we should cut expenditures and cut employees is when the economy is doing well, and there is an example of that.
Amen.
It's also a time when you can raise taxes. It was under William Jefferson Clinton, and it happened. Taxes were raised, and for the first time since Ronald Reagan became president, the percentage of debt to GDP stabilized.
It was actually also during George H.W. Bush.
Give him credit then too. But you don't cut government expenditures when unemployment is 10%. I know of no argument. Do you think we should? Today, should we cut government expenditures?
Yes.
at the federal level?
I think we should. Because I don't think it's fair. I don't think it's fair to pass. I think at some point you have to take your medicine. I mean, you want to pass it all down to future generations so that we can have our cake. But at some point, shouldn't we be responsible for our decisions? And shouldn't we take our own medicine without burdening future generations?
Yes, we should. But let me tell you what, we are not helping.
We're going to let you
generation.
respond to the discussants. This. If you have any comments for the discussants, we will
My main
end this
comment is
discussion.
that I have a plane to catch.
Excellent. Well, we will let you go and catch your plane. Thank you very much. I hope you stay for Joel Pracken, and have a great night.